What German civilians said when 7,000 tons of explosives blew up their harbor in seconds cold open. The air raid sirens had stopped 20 minutes ago. In the cramped apartment overlooking Wilhelmshaven's inner harbor, Margarete Böhm pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching the all-clear crews emerge from the bunkers below. Her breath fogged the window. Outside, in the pre-dawn darkness of March 14, 1945, dock workers were already shuffling back toward the waterfront, their silhouettes bent against the North Sea wind that never stopped howling through this godforsaken port city. She didn't see the flash. No one did, not really. The human eye can't process that kind of light. What she remembered later, when the British interrogators asked her to describe it, was the window turning white, pure white, as if God had switched off the night and replaced it with something that had no color at all, just a burning absence where darkness used to be. Then the sound, not an explosion, that came later. First came a noise like the earth itself splitting open, a grinding roar that started somewhere below hearing and climbed into a scream that shattered every window on Ebertstrasse. The glass punched inward in a spray of crystal shards. Margaret's body flew backward, her skull cracking against the wooden floor, and for a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't understand why her apartment had been turned inside out. When she crawled to what remained of the window frame, bleeding from a dozen cuts, she looked out at where the harbor used to be. There was nothing. No docks, no warehouses, no cranes, no munitions freighter, MV Theodore Riedel, that had been anchored 300 meters offshore, its hull packed with 7,000 tons of explosives meant for the Eastern Front. Just a crater. And above it, a pillar of fire that climbed into the sky like a judgment. What do you say when your entire world evaporates in a single heartbeat? When everything you thought was solid, steel, stone, water, ground, simply ceases to exist, the German civilians of Wilhelmshaven were about to find out. Flashback to context. 3 weeks earlier, the Theodore Riedel had limped into Wilhelmshaven under cover of darkness. Her holds crammed with munitions destined for Army Group Vistula. General Gotthard Heinrici was screaming for ammunition. The Red Army was 40 kilometers from Berlin. Every shell mattered now. But the Reich's logistics network had collapsed into chaos. Rail lines were bombed, trucks had no fuel, the Luftwaffe barely flew. So the Navy, or what remained of it, had been ordered to move ammunition by sea, hugging the Baltic coast, then cutting through the North Sea to Hamburg and Bremen. The Theodore Riedel was a converted cargo freighter, 12 years old, her hull streaked with rust and poorly patched damage from a near miss in Gdansk harbor 2 months prior. She carried 4,200 tons of artillery shells, 800 tons of aerial bombs, 900 tons of torpedo warheads, miscellaneous, small arms, ammunition, enough composition B explosive to level a small city. Her captain, Oberleutnant José Werner Kohl, had protested. The ship was in no condition for this kind of cargo. Her crew was too small. Her fire suppression systems were makeshift at best. Loading this much ordnance onto a single vessel violated every maritime safety protocol ever written. Do you want to explain to the Führer why his ammunition is sitting in a warehouse while German soldiers die for lack of shells? The harbor master had asked him. Kohl had no answer to that, so the Theodore Riedel had been loaded, overstuffed like a Christmas goose, and sent creeping up the coast with 2 escort vessels that turned back after entering the Jade Bay. By the time she reached Wilhelmshaven on March 12th, her engines were overheating and her crew was half dead from exhaustion. The plan was to offload half her cargo here, send the rest to Hamburg by rail, and get the damned ship into dry dock before she sank at her moorings. But the rail lines were cut. British bombers had hit the marshalling yards at Oldenburg the previous night, so the Theodore Riedel sat anchored in the inner harbor, her holds still packed, while port officials tried to find trucks that didn't exist and fuel that had vanished into the black market. The city of Wilhelmshaven, meanwhile, had its own problems. By March 1945, the once proud naval base was a skeleton. The U-boat pens were still operational, but the submarine fleet had been reduced to a handful of boats crewed by teenagers. The civilian population had swollen with refugees fleeing the east, women and children who slept in schools, churches, cellars, anywhere with a roof. Food was scarce, medicine was scarcer. Everyone knew the war was lost, but no one dared say it out loud. Goebbels' propaganda still blared from the loudspeakers. Victory or death, the Führer's miracle weapons will turn the tide. But in the bread lines, in the shelters, in the whispered conversations at the ration office, the truth was obvious. The Americans were across the Rhine, the Russians were at the Oder, Germany was being crushed from both sides. And here in Wilhelmshaven, a floating bomb sat in the harbor, ticking. On the morning of March 13th, a Luftwaffe liaison officer named Major Ernst Vogel arrived from Bremen with new orders. The Theodore Riedel's cargo was to be transported by barge to Hamburg, a slow, dangerous journey through mined waters, but the only option left. How long will the loading take? Vogel asked. 3 days? Cole replied. Maybe 4. You have 2. That's insane. My men are exhausted. The dock cranes are... 2 days, Capitaine, or I'll have you shot for defeatism and find someone else to do it. Cole swallowed the rage climbing his throat and nodded. That night, March 13th, the British sent a small raid. 18 Mosquito bombers targeting the U-boat Pens. The raid was routine, almost perfunctory. Most of the bombs missed. A few warehouses burned. The city's flak batteries drove the planes off after 30 minutes. No one paid much attention to the Theodore Riedel still sitting in the harbor, still packed with enough explosives to obliterate the waterfront. No one except Private Hans Dietrich, a 20-year-old guard stationed at the harbor entrance. Hans had been drafted in 1944, served 3 months on the Eastern Front, and been sent home with frostbite and nightmares. Now he stood watch over a dying port in a dying Reich, smoking black market cigarettes, and wondering if his mother in Dresden was still alive. At 11:47 p.m., Hans saw something odd, a small boat, a rowboat maybe, moving through the harbor mouth. No lights, no engine sound, just the faint splash of oars. He raised his rifle. "Halt! Identify yourself!" No response. The boat disappeared behind a moored barge. Hans should have reported it, should have raised the alarm, but he was tired and cold and sick of this fucking war, and the harbor was full of small boats, fishermen, smugglers, refugees, who could keep track. He let it go. At 4:53 a.m. on March the 14th, the Theodore Riedel exploded. The core event unfolds in real time. 4:53 a.m. The detonation originated in Hold 3, where the aerial bombs were stored. Whether it was sabotage, a careless cigarette, a faulty fuse, or an unexplained chemical reaction, no one would ever know. The investigation that followed found no hull, no survivors, no evidence. What is known? In the space of 0.3 seconds, 7,000 tons of high explosives underwent rapid, uncontrolled decomposition. The blast wave moved outward at 1,800 meters per second. The Theodore Riedel ceased to exist as a physical object. She didn't sink. She didn't burn. She simply transformed into a superheated gas that expanded with unimaginable violence, vaporizing the water around her, liquefying the metal fragments of her hull, creating a pressure wave so intense it functioned as a solid wall. The 2 ships moored nearest to her, a minesweeper and a supply trawler, disintegrated, not damaged, disintegrated, reduced to molecular debris that mixed with the firestorm. The blast wave hit the waterfront at a speed faster than the sound. Warehouse 6, a massive steel structure holding naval supplies, crumpled like paper. Its walls blew outward in all directions, launching sheets of corrugated metal through the air like razor-edged playing cards. One section, weighing 2 tons, flew over 300 meters and sliced through an apartment building, shearing off the entire 4th floor. Dock Crane 7, a 50-meter-tall steel tower, snapped at its base and toppled into the inferno. The harbor water itself became a weapon. Millions of gallons were displaced upward and outward in a tsunami that surged through the port district, crashing through ground-floor windows, drowning anyone unlucky enough to be in its path, then retreating in a roaring undertow that dragged wreckage and bodies back into the burning crater. 4:54 a.m., Klaus Richter, chief engineer at the Naval Repair Facility, was in his office when the world ended. His building was 800 meters from the Theodore Riedel's anchorage, far enough to survive, close enough to feel like being inside a cathedral bell when it's struck with a sledgehammer. The floor punched upward, throwing him into the ceiling. The ceiling came down on top of him. His left arm snapped, his ribs broke, he tasted blood and dust and felt something warm running down his face. When he could see again, minutes, hours, he didn't know, he crawled through the wreckage of his office toward the door, or where the door used to be. The entire wall was gone. Just open air, and beyond it, a vision of hell. The harbor was a sea of fire. No, fire didn't describe it. Fire was orange and red. This was white and blue, chemical flames feeding on fuel oil and exploded ordnance, burning so hot the metal debris glowed. The heat reached him even at this distance, a dry desert wind that made his exposed skin blister. Klaus started laughing, couldn't help it. The sound came out of him in choked, hysterical gasps. "We're dead," he said to no one. "We're all fucking dead." 5:02 a.m., Margarete Böhm pulled herself upright, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that wouldn't stop. Her apartment was destroyed. The roof had caved in. The walls had shifted. Everything was covered in a fine grey dust that tasted like concrete and ash. She stumbled toward the stairs, stepping over her shattered furniture, not really seeing it, her brain unable to process the scale of what had just happened. The stairwell was full of people, neighbors, bleeding, crying, screaming questions no one could answer because no one could hear. Was ist passiert? Wo ist Oma? Ich finde meine Kinder nicht. Margarete pushed through them, driven by some animal instinct to get outside, to see, to understand. When she reached the street, she stopped. Ebertstrasse was gone. Not damaged, gone. The buildings on the harbor side had been flattened, reduced to rubble that spread across the pavement like a breaking wave frozen in stone. The buildings on the inland side, her building, were half collapsed, their facades ripped off, exposing the interiors like dollhouses. And over it all, the pillar of fire. It rose from the crater where the harbor used to be, a column of flame 300 meters wide, climbing into the sky, feeding on its own heat, creating its own weather system. Debris rained down, chunks of metal, pieces of wood, unidentifiable objects that thudded into the rubble or splashed into the flooded streets. A woman next to Margaret was praying in Latin, her voice hoarse and desperate. Another was calling for her husband, screaming his name over and over. A man with no face, his features burned away, just raw meat, walked past in silence, his hands outstretched, feeling his way through the nightmare. Margarete heard someone speak, turned, saw an elderly man, his hair white with dust, his eyes hollow. Das war Gott, he said quietly. Gott straft uns. God is punishing us. 5:15 a.m. At the Marine Kommandoamt, the Naval Command Center on the city's outskirts, Konteradmiral Friedrich Ruger was trying to make sense of the reports flooding in. An explosion at the harbor, multiple casualties, fire services unable to approach, entire waterfront district destroyed. Ruger grabbed the phone. Get me the harbor master, now! Static, then a voice, thin and trembling. Sir, the harbor office is gone. I'm calling from a telephone box 3 blocks inland, the entire port. The Theodore Rydell, was it the Theodore Rydell? Silence. Answer me, damn it. Sir, there is no ship, there is no harbor, there is... The voice broke. There is nothing, sir. It's gone. Ruge felt his stomach turn to ice. 7,000 tons of ordnance, in the middle of a civilian port, in the middle of a city. Casualties? I don't know. Hundreds, maybe thousands. I can't get close enough to... The line went dead. Ruger stood frozen for 5 seconds, his mind calculating. Then he turned to his aide. Alert Berlin. Notify the Gauleiter. Activate all civil defense units. Evacuate a 3-kilometer radius from the harbor. Move. But even as he gave the orders, he knew it was too late. The damage was done. The people were already dead or dying. All he could do now was manage the catastrophe. And explain to Berlin how the Kriegsmarine had just vaporized one of Germany's last functioning naval bases. 5:45 a.m., the fires were spreading. Fuel oil from ruptured storage tanks fed the flames. Gas mains, severed by the blast, ignited in roaring geysers of blue fire. Collapsed buildings smoldered, their wooden frames burning slowly, trapping survivors beneath the rubble. The fire brigade had been destroyed in the first seconds. Their station, located near the harbor for quick response to ship fires, had been directly in the blast zone. Of the 47 firefighters on duty, 32 died instantly. The survivors were injured, their equipment obliterated. Brigadeführer Otto Schramm, commander of the Wilhelmshaven Civil Defense, organized what he could. Fire crews from neighboring towns, Wehrmacht soldiers, Hitler Youth, prisoners from a nearby labor camp, anyone who could hold a shovel or carry a stretcher. But when they reached the waterfront, they stopped. There was nothing to fight, no buildings to save, no fires to suppress, just a crater and an inferno and a wasteland of twisted metal and shattered stone that radiated heat like the mouth of a furnace. Pull back, Schramm ordered. Establish a perimeter. Search for survivors in the outer zones. One of his men, a teenager named Friedrich, pointed toward the crater. Sir, what about anyone in there is dead? Focus on the living. 6:30 a.m. In the cellars and shelters of the surviving districts, the people of Wilhelmshaven tried to understand. Some prayed, some wept, some sat in silence, their minds broken by the enormity of what they'd witnessed. In Shelter 14, beneath an apartment block 2 kilometers from the harbor, a woman named Helga Fischer clutched her 2 children and tried to explain. It was an accident, she whispered. Just an accident. But why? Her daughter asked. Why did it explode? I don't know, Liebling. I don't know. Her son, 9 years old, looked up at her with eyes too old for his age. The British did it. They dropped a bomb. No, the British. The raid was hours ago. Then who? Helga had no answer. Around them, other conversations echoed the same confusion, the same desperate search for meaning. It was sabotage. The Americans have a new weapon. God is punishing us for our sins. The ship was poorly loaded. Criminal negligence. This is what happens when you fill a ship with that much explosive. Everyone had a theory. No one had the truth. Second layer of consequences. By midday, the scale of the disaster was becoming clear. The official count, compiled weeks later, recorded 1,247 dead and 3,800 injured. But the true number was almost certainly higher. Refugees, forced laborers, prisoners, people whose names appeared on no census, were simply erased, their bodies vaporized or buried beneath rubble that was never fully excavated. The port district was annihilated. 23 city blocks reduced to ruins, 41 ships destroyed, every dock, crane, warehouse, and facility within 800 meters of the explosion obliterated. The economic impact was staggering. Wilhelmshaven's capacity as a naval base, already diminished, was now effectively zero. The U-boat pens survived, but without the support infrastructure, they were useless. The city's remaining war industries ground to a halt. In Berlin, the news was received with predictable fury. Reichsminister Albert Speer, already overwhelmed by the collapse of Germany's industrial base, read the report with mounting rage. 7,000 tons of irreplaceable ammunition lost, a vital port destroyed, over 1,000 civilian deaths. Who authorized this? He demanded. No one had a good answer. The decision to load the Theodor Riedel had been made at a mid-level logistics office in Kiel, signed off by officers who were now conveniently unreachable. The Kriegsmarine blamed the army blamed the navy, everyone blamed the British, even though the bomber raid had ended hours before the explosion. Speer considered launching a formal investigation, then dismissed the idea. What was the point? The war would be over in weeks. There was no time for scapegoats. Instead, he issued a terse order. All future munitions transport would be conducted in smaller batches, multiple ships, never more than 1,000 tons per vessel. The order reached exactly no one. By mid-March 1945, Germany's military logistics system existed only on paper. Meanwhile, in Wilhelmshaven, the survivors struggled to rebuild. There was no rebuilding, not really. The infrastructure was gone, the labor force was dead or scattered. The Nazi Party officials who should have coordinated relief efforts were already fleeing westward, ahead of the advancing British. What emerged instead was a kind of organic, desperate cooperation. Neighbors dug neighbors out of the rubble, women formed bucket brigades to fight fires, doctors operated in the streets using whatever supplies they could scavenge. Margarete Böhm spent 3 days pulling bodies from collapsed buildings. She didn't count them, couldn't. After the first dozen, they stopped being people and became just weight, mass, obstacles to be moved. On the third night, she sat on a pile of rubble, her hands blistered and bleeding, and tried to remember what her life had been like before. She couldn't. It felt like the world had been split into two, before the explosion and after. And the person she'd been before, the woman who worried about ration cards and complained about the cold, that person was dead, buried under the same rubble that had buried her city. In the Naval Command Center, Konter-Admiral Ruger composed his final report for Berlin. He kept it clinical, factual, devoid of emotion. The facts were horrific enough. But in the margin, in handwriting almost too small to read, he wrote a single sentence that never made it into the official record. We did this to ourselves. Broader strategic and moral implications. The explosion of the Theodor Riedel was a microcosm of Germany's collapse in the spring of 1945. The decision to pack 7,000 tons of explosives onto a single, poorly maintained ship reflected the desperation of a regime that had lost all capacity for rational planning. The failure to evacuate the surrounding area before loading such a dangerous cargo reflected the Nazi state's utter contempt for its own citizens. The inability to respond effectively to the disaster reflected the disintegration of Germany's civil and military infrastructure. But more than that, it revealed the human cost of fighting a war long after it was lost. By March 1945, everyone in Germany, from the highest general to the lowliest private, knew the war was over. The question was not whether Germany would lose, but when and how much destruction would occur before the inevitable end. Yet the machinery ground on. Orders were issued, shipments were made, soldiers were sent to die in battles that meant nothing, and thousands of tons of explosives were crammed into a rusting ship because someone in an office in Kiel needed to meet a quota, and someone else in Berlin needed to believe that one more shipment of shells would change the outcome. The people of Wilhelmshaven paid the price for that delusion. Their deaths were not strategic. The explosion advanced no one's cause, changed no military calculation, altered no political outcome. It was pure waste, human lives incinerated, for nothing, a city destroyed in service of a fantasy. And yet, in the rubble, something else emerged. The official narrative, the Goebbels propaganda, the party's insistence on final victory, All of it evaporated in the face of that fireball. You cannot lie to people who have watched their neighbors vaporize. You cannot demand loyalty from citizens you've just killed through negligence. In the shelters and cellars of Wilhelmshaven, the last threads of faith in the Nazi regime burned away. People stopped repeating the slogans, stopped believing the promises, stopped pretending. When the British arrived 6 weeks later, they found a population that greeted them not with resistance, but with exhaustion. The war was over. Everyone knew it. The explosion had simply made it undeniable. Klaus Richter, the engineer who survived, put it simply in a letter he wrote years later. We had believed or tried to believe that all the suffering had meaning, that we were fighting for something, but when 7,000 tons of our own ammunition exploded in our own harbor and killed our own people, we understood there was no meaning, there never had been, we were just destroying ourselves. That realization, that the war was not a tragedy inflicted by enemies, but a suicide committed by Germany itself, was perhaps the explosion's most lasting impact. The closing scene on March 28, 1945, 2 weeks after the explosion, Margarete Böhm returned to what remained of her apartment building. The street was quiet now. The fires had burned out, the bodies had been removed, the rubble had been sorted into piles, useful material here, debris there, unidentifiable remains in a mass grave outside the city. She climbed the broken stairs carefully, testing each step. The 4th-floor landing was gone. The 5th floor, her floor, was partially collapsed, the hallway tilted at a dangerous angle. Her apartment door hung from one hinge. Inside, everything was exactly as she'd left it. The shattered window, the overturned furniture, the layer of dust that coated every surface like snow. She walked to the window frame. No glass now, just an empty rectangle opening onto the harbor. The crater was still there, a massive bite taken out of the waterfront, filled with dark water that reflected nothing. The fires had finally died. The smoke had cleared. In the distance, she could see a handful of workers picking through the ruins, but they were just dots, too far away to matter. Margarete stood there for a long time, watching the water lap against the broken edge of the harbor wall. She thought about her husband, dead in Russia 2 years ago, her brother, lost at Stalingrad, her mother, buried in the rubble somewhere below. She thought about the old man who'd said God was punishing them. Maybe he was right, or maybe God had nothing to do with it. Maybe this was just what happened when men filled ships with explosives and forgot that other people existed. In her pocket, she felt the weight of the identification papers she'd been issued yesterday. Refugee status, permission to evacuate westward, toward the British lines, away from the Russians. She would leave tomorrow. There was nothing left here to stay for. But tonight, she stood at the window and watched the dead harbor and tried to remember the sound of the explosion. She couldn't. It had been too loud, too large, too complete. Her memory had simply refused to record it. All she had was the after, the silence, the fire, the nothing. And perhaps that was mercy. In the darkness, Margarete Böhm whispered a question to the empty air, not expecting an answer, not needing one. What did we say? What were the words? But there had been no words. That was the truth of it. When the world explodes around you, when everything you know becomes fire and ash and screaming metal, you don't speak. You just stand there in the aftermath and try to remember how to breathe.